Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Where is the Music podcast. Thank you for tuning back in again with me. Before we start, I just want to say that if you feel like you want to support this podcast, you can find the Patreon account where you can become a patron of it and send any kind of amount. Can be just a few dollars, the amount for just a coffee or something more. Anything, you will be greatly appreciated. And the link for the account Patreon should be available directly from the page where you're listening this podcast from, whether it's Spotify, Apple, or somewhere else. That should be that should be happening. I should be able to make it happening. So today, I know that the title of this episode is probably provoking some outrage in a few of you. Rock is dead. How dare you say something like that? Well, the motivation for this podcast comes from a general sense of chaos that I often perceive when I hear how musical genres are discussed, meaning with little or no attention at all for what the term genre or style might mean. Often, even very musical people, very educated musicians, let's say by virtue of being expert in one or another kind of music, tend to overlook quite significant aspects of other kinds of music. At university, I remember I learned that musical instruments are described and grouped, defined in ways that are not very consistent. For example, a violin is a string instrument, of course, because it has 4 strings. But a guitar has 6 strings and is defined as a fretted instrument. It's quite confusing if you think about a string quartet. What are you picturing, violins or guitars? Piano, on a different note, is a percussion instrument like drums. But piano has a lot more strings than a violin. Oboe or bassoon are woodwinds. Trumpet is a brass. The lesson, I remember, showed how in the category of musical instruments, sometimes it's the material that defines a group of instruments, in the case, for example, of brass. Sometimes the means of production, in the case, for example, of woodwind, wind that goes through the wood. Sometimes it's the player action on the instrument, like in the case of percussion, that describe that speaks of the main feature of the instrument. And in this case, percussion is similar between drums and piano. So there is the moment you start looking at this, you realize that there is a bit of confusion. And I feel the same confusion happens for musical genres. That's why I brought the example of musical instruments up. One would expect that a genre of music is defined by its stylistic features, the way it sounds. It is probably the way we tend to use these terms in conversation, terms like rock, classical, or jazz. But I don't think it's the case, and I hope that this episode will make some clearance, will help you making some clearance on a topic of such importance. After all, if we talk about music, knowing and agreeing on what kind of music are we talking about should be of primary importance. In a way, the distinctions, the way I see it, the distinction we're about to make are similar to the distinction between language, grammar, and style in literary form. If anything, the chaos we are about to unfold speaks of how poor is communication and language with regards to describing music, if compared to how intuitively we identify different sounds, instruments, styles, and genres. So, I will be discussing rock, jazz, pop, and classical music. Let's start simple. Classical music. When we think of classical music, we think of music related to a period before modern contemporary times. And by extension, everything that happened before today may fall in the category of classical. But to be precise, classical identifies a specific period. The classical composers were Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. A style of music that became deeply significant for posterity, still to today, through which modernity defines almost everything else. Music is often described as pre-classical or not classical or anti-classical or with some references to classical. In university, I was taught to distinguish between classical music with the capital letter, referring to that period, roughly between 1750 to 1826, which is the birth of Mozart and the death of Beethoven. And classical music, I was saying, with a capital letter, and classical music with lowercase letter, referring to everything that is not modern or contemporary, which is obviously a much broader container. But at one level deeper, we find that the classical period, the one of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, has established an attitude towards music expression, creation, and fruition that influenced musical history since then. The style of those composers was so significant that the whole musical language was reshaped and adjusted according to it. Later musicians in Europe could not avoid the influence of Haydn, Mozart, nor Beethoven when writing music. Today we often show the qualities of later music by comparing it to those of the classical period and describe the music of 17th or early 18th century as pre-classical, as if composers were creating their style in an attempt to approach a finalized version of it, the classical style. Today many would even agree that the idea that the music of Bach, Handel or Scarlatti often displays solutions that pronounce classical style, as if they were unconsciously driven towards it. This last point, in my opinion, betrays a vision of history highly deterministic, as if art is following a trajectory from less to more progressed or advanced, as if, for example, Brahms and Wagner understood better music than Bach and Handel did, and like Debussy and Stravinsky then understood better music than Brahms and Wagner. So it might be eventually useful for a variety of reasons to learn music history through a single trajectory of development or stylistic advancement. But it's also dangerous because it blinds us from the appreciation of each style as authentically tied to the aesthetic sensitivity of its time. One example of how misleading this deterministic view of history can be might be offered by the year of invention of the piano. Many of you might know that it was invented at the beginning of the 1700s, and the fact that it hasn't been taken up by the greatest composer of the time, it tells something about what's the real role of technical progress. The invention of the piano, which one would intuitively consider as at the time an advancement from, let's say, the harpsichord and or the organ. These today, these two instruments are sometimes considered at least early versions of piano. But the hammer action that defines the mechanics of the modern piano was brought to life by Bartolomeo Cristofori in the early 1700s. So the instrument, piano, was available already then, but has not been used by composers until many decades after its invention. And famously, Bach wasn't interested at all in it. This speaks about this idea of progress and advancement in art. It is possibly the case that the piano was not in line with the perception of beauty or expression of ideas of the early 1700s, but it was probably better suited to later on types of creativity. So classical music is not a genre. It is at once a period in history, either the period of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, or everything before today, depending on the context. Alternatively, it is a style of music, meaning music that is created following particular techniques and with particular aesthetic aims in mind. For example, the use of tonal harmony, or the use of known electric instruments, or music fully written on a score by a single composer is another example. But today the term is a hybrid of everything. It's very confusing to me. A living composer that writes scores of tonal music for acoustic instrument is often called classical. For example, like Einaudi. As you see, in this case, the term classical refers to a style of making music. When classical music is used to identify a genre, it is only geographic and historic borders that can contain the definition. The music written in Europe before modern times, though, is too vast and various to fit adequately into one large umbrella. If you want to read more about how the classical composers Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven have created a style so influential that modified the musical language and eventually became a modern reference for the entire output of Western European music, I recommend the first chapters of The Classical Style by Charles Rosen. It's a dense and heavy book, but in those opening chapters, it's quite remarkable in outlining the reasons of how this was done. Next we have jazz. Jazz is a container for everything and anything. The case for jazz as a music genre is even more interesting to me than the classical one, because it relates to the whole Western world, not just Europe, and depending for the most part on non-written music. By that I mean music that is transmitted orally or through recordings. So it is at once written, non-written, and recorded. So with jazz, we are looking at music that has originated in America in the early decades of 1900, and the actual stylistic origins are difficult to point out. African rhythms, work songs, gospel singing, blues, street bands, musicals, by dancing music, improvised music, and probably the list continues for a bit. Each of these styles of making music is not jazz per se, and jazz does not need to refer to each to be true jazz. Jazz is not depending on a geographic area, so it's not an American phenomenon, or even though it has started there. Europe has been making great jazz. It's not a language. Every European non-English culture has appropriated idioms and even tunes from the jazz songbook, and of course, it's not depending on an ethnicity or not even a time period. It's probably a style. Is jazz a style then? Possibly. If you think of those characteristics of jazz styles that make a tune sound jazz, then yes, anything really can be jazz. For example, a tune such as Embraceable You by Gershwin goes like this. So this tune has score, an original score written by George Gershwin, but therefore contradicts a bit the oral tradition of jazz. And it has also many later versions interpreted by a variety of jazz artists. So which version is the right version of Embraceable You? It's easy to say none of them, but then if they are all jazz version, but none is the right version of Embraceable You, that means that Embraceable You is definitely not a jazz tune. I mean, all those versions are, but not the original one. That's interesting, huh? So the term jazz standard helps us in this confusion. It is a tune, a standard is a tune that has been interpreted in many different ways, that has survived the decades and has inspired artists and listeners alike so much that has become a standard piece of music onto which musicians develop their take. So, Embraceable You is not a jazz tune, but has entered the jazz repertoire by virtue of having inspired artists for generations, so that each can express their individual style through a composition that already carries some meaning for the listener. So, individual style then is the currency. A jazz artist is someone who takes an existing material, like Embraceable You, and develops it through their personal taste. A composition such as Embraceable You acts like an idea, perhaps originated at some point by someone and written down, in this case by George Gershwin, an idea that travels through conversations and takes slightly different shapes depending on who is expressing it at one time. There are compositions that are created to be interpreted, like artists such as Miles Davis or Charles Mingus famously sketched their ideas and wanted their collaborators to add their own. Often, there isn't an original version of it. The first recording of it becoming the closest thing to the original there is. So, transitioning from one form to another, transformation is possibly what defines jazz at its core, which is the opposite of classical music, where every interpretation we hear is directly related to an original version, enigmatically enclosed in the score. If transition and transformation are key to jazz music, what emerges is the intrinsic collaborative nature of jazz as a kind of music. I'm deliberately avoiding the term style or genre. If I play jazz, what I'm doing is referring to pre-existing material, a tune, a chord, a sequence, a rhythm, a technique, or just a vision, however defined, and making it mine. I'll ornament and modify it with the idioms I took from other influences. A bluesy note or a swing rhythm, which is another way of collaborating with the language. Or I'll improvise in the manner I'm most familiar with, or that I enjoy the most, which also reflects the musical influences I had so far. So this is to highlight the collaborative nature of jazz. What is jazz today? Everything that involves transformation as the artistic aim of a performance. No wonder why very often the term improvisation is used interchangeably with the term jazz nowadays. Improvisation is considered the evidence that we are hearing jazz. Does that mean that if I am improvising, I am by default playing jazz? Not at all. One can improvise in a million different styles. Jazz is the one type of music that demands your improvisation to be the appropriate balance between the style at hand, whether it is swing, boogie, Dixie, bebop, avant-garde, bossa, and your individual personal voice. Whether you can improvise in a classical style or in Indian raga or in Arabic scales or in a Balkan rhythms, you must adhere to the idioms of that style. While in jazz, the artist is one who masters the idiom so well that his or her personality shines through it, individually unique and impossible to mistake for someone else's. This is why the history of jazz is the history of the artists who made jazz. Without individuals, there is no interpretation, there is no transformation, no jazz. Here we see the strong balance between collaboration and individualism that had this very American music capturing the entire world. Is jazz a style then? I think it is more of an attitude towards creativity, a way of modifying existing material. Any tune can become jazz if treated properly. Any musical material can become idiomatic and be used, reused, transformed, interpreted if the goal is to express individuality within a collaborative environment. Of course, jazz artists employ musical styles. You can hear everything from blues to swing, from gospel to rhythm blues, from boogie to bebop. The term jazz fusion is exemplary, since there could be no other way of describing a kind of music that within one track will mix and mash all sorts of disparate jazz and world influences. It is a way of avoiding the problem of labeling music with a genre. Today, jazz is open, as it should, to everything. Not being a style, it allows no boundaries to expressive devices or solutions. The next case is pop music. Pop, in a way, it's an easier case to make, in my opinion. As a music phenomenon, it is historically and creatively entangled with the market of musical media consumption on mass scales. Without radio, TV, internet, we would hardly have any pop artists at all. That being said, I think we should look at pop music with the curious eye and ear of those who want to make sense of it rather than feeling contempt about it. And contempt might arise as one understands how pop artworks are created paying significant attention to what sells at one time. When creativity is compromised or looks like being compromised by sales, or when we have a feeling that an artist has been corrupted by success and fame, then we can't but feel cheated, as the art they present is no longer authentic. In the years, I learned to separate between my feelings toward a musician and her music, and the pop musical phenomenon considered more broadly, something that includes the artist, the music, the public sphere, the artist's performances and the public persona, the impact on the listener and on the cultural environment. The pop artist, for example, is not just a very unique musical voice. Too often they are singers, by the way. Isn't it a bit coincidental? As for the fact that, as a famous comedian puts it, too often they are also young and sexy. Isn't it a bit too coincidental? No? Why the greatest pop artist of the time has never been an ugly old dude, bald with a broken leg? Isn't it something to ponder about? So, a pop artist is also a mixture of stylistic dimensions. Someone who dresses and speaks unusually, who cares for non-politically correct causes, someone who inhabits various worlds at the same time. The creative type, someone who sees commonalities among widely diverse worlds, like music and poetry. And as many great songwriters have done, is capable of pairing music with words in ways that are new and inspiring. Often, their music with words come with the way of performing, a unique style of public appearance, an exuberant, extravagant, totally unique position on social or political issues, a confident, often stubborn, nevertheless appealing attitude of my way or the highway. This is to say that there is more to pop music that meets the eye. Perhaps a good pop song is delivering subliminally a wide range of sensations that are linked to all sorts of dimensions beyond the emotional sense of rebellion towards the authorities, maybe physical attraction, maybe freedom of expression, ideas that are hybrid and non-categoric, maybe a sense of boldness and self-confidence, etc. I'm taking probably a long road to say that to achieve all of that, a pop song needs to be open to everything, literally everything, musical and non-musical, and at the same time needs to be a very accurate, detailed selection and balance of the chosen elements, because the goal is to appeal to the right public in the right way. In a way, it must be very easy to digest at first hearing, meaning each style and technical device employed needs to be selected and distilled carefully. For example, we can hear a blues reference, but not a blues improvisation, just enough to let us wander in that bluesy direction, but not too much to get lost there. And in another way, it must be absolutely unique in its mix of elements, meaning absolutely original in its final form. I find funny that so many people, often musically educated, describe the creative effort behind successful pop music as trivial, irrelevant, insignificant. Since the song is made with 4 chords, it looks to them as if it is easy to do. Truth is that the perfect balance of all the elements in it, so that the tune has some chance to be noticed, not even liked or demanded, but it's just very delicate, job of artists and producers. And for for the big labels, we're talking about teams of producers and sound engineers, people for which the core sequence is the least of the problems. For example, which sound out of 3000 should the guitar have and why? Which notes exactly? Is it a 92 beat per minute or a 94 beat per minute? How much reverb should the voice have in the verse versus the chorus and why? Each choice might affect positively or negatively the world of emotional connections experienced by the listener. So it is reasonable that a pop tune is defined better by all the musical influences it carries rather than its chord sequence. For this reason, pop is a genre, in my estimation. Everything is allowed as long as the choice aims at triggering a reaction from the listener. The same tune will be liked by one listener because of the lyrics, by another because of the bluesy vocals, by another because of the rock beat, by another because of the country style guitars used in the verse, and by another because of the dancing grooves and moves, by another because of the visual appeal projected by the artist. Yes, pop artists are visual artists thanks to also music videos and CD booklets, etc. Certain stylistic choices then don't match the genre. For example, an instrumental solo that is longer than a certain number of seconds might distract from the core idea of the tune. Or maybe a whole song longer than 3 minutes might challenge the attention span of a younger listener, to which most pop music is eventually directed. It is a genre that wants original versions of a song. In this way, it is different from jazz and more like classical music. The original tune is the reference by which to elevate the other instances. A live performance, an interpretation by another artist, a cover version, and only in pop and rock, as we shall see, a tune, the original of course, can become a classic, meaning it has crossed many generation gaps, sustained the commercial competition for decades, sometimes survived its creators and have become a standard for evaluating the rest. Yesterday by the Beatles, for example, is a classic. It is very difficult to sing Yesterday today and not be booed. Daring to touch a song like that is at your own risk. One must be very talented and have something very unique to add to it in order to win the demands imposed by the genre, in this case triggering popular emotions while being authentic, and the restrictions imposed by the authority, in this case represented by the Beatles themselves. So a genre of music like pop might employ styles of music like blues, like country or swing. Each style is a language, a collection of techniques and expressive devices that are highly idiomatic and recognizable. A genre might be open to any new idioms as long as they don't conflict with the basic goals, which in the case of pop have to do with appeal to popular taste. On a different note, rock was a genre and now it is a style. With regards to rock, I will be making some bold claims, which are not related to how much rock has meant to me in my personal music upbringing, Neither are a quality judgment on individual bands or artists in the rock area. I grew up personally with Led Zeppelin, Queen, Jimi Hendrix, and many more artists that define rock as a music genre. My take in this context is that, as per musical instruments that are sometimes identified by the material they're built with, sometimes by the way sound is produced with them, rock points at a kind of music that is at once a style of expression, for example, loud electric guitars, heavy drum beats, also is a social statement, typically rebellion against some authority, but also is an opportunity for social cohesion, mostly for the young, by giving, for example, a voice to sometimes very personal issues or feeling like alienation or love. So this is to say that rock is not just about music. Compared to pop, rock does seem to be more restrictive in terms of what choices allow for inclusion in the genre. Top elements are the presence of at least one electric guitar, historically the signature of rock. Forms and song structures tend to be very simple, as rock music is not written, sometimes not even a sketch, but there are obviously exceptions. Relying only on the talents in the band to memorize and reconstruct the form of the tune each time. Instrumental improvisation, like guitar or solo drums, is usually fairly limited, being instrumental expertise subordinate to other dimensions of expression. With few exceptions, of course. Hendrix, for example, is an unsurpassed guitar player till today. Although there are other kinds of improvisation, like for example, bands that stay on a chord for 10 minutes during a live performance while the lead singer speaks to the crowd, or Jimi Hendrix once again destroying his guitar on stage, are different kinds of improvisation. So the social cohesion aspect of a rock concert seems to be the main reference to have if we want to find the essence of rock. Songs needs to sound as the public knows them from the records. Therefore, there is an element of popular appeal. But the live event is the only occasion when they are brought to life in a real sense, not the recording. In this way, rock bands and particularly rock singers act in a similar way to priests, officers in charge of a social event that carries many elements of a religious ritual. By the way, all musical events involve in a way or another some kind of rituals shared by musicians and listeners, but rock concerts, since Woodstock, do place a particular interest in that aspect of the performance, creating musical experiences where the audience is allowed and encouraged to join through dancing all the way to hypnosis. No wonder why the make love don't make war people, the hippie phenomenon and psychedelics in the 70s have found in rock music a comfortable home. And here is my bold claim: rock is dead. It seems to me that the social and political conditions that brought rock to the forefront of the musical culture no longer exist. So the determination to rebel against established authority has no more trajectory forward. In the 80s and 90s, the greatest rock bands were swallowed by the market, and it couldn't have been otherwise. So the message of rebellion coming from them were becoming less and less strong and less needed by their listeners, who were quite happy to accept the social compromises brought by modern consumerism. So, are you saying that since the 70s there is nothing to rebel against? Of course not. There is plenty. But rock cannot do it, or at least hasn't done it. From outspoken and bold stances against wars and money, for open love, freedom, and social rights, rock has adjusted its target to more personal issues and social alienation. Think of the song Creep by Radiohead in 1993, or topics of faith. Think of Losing My Religion by REM in 1991, and the evergreen themes of love and friendship, but also themes like sex, death, alcohol, drugs, fame. A separate case possibly should be made for other types of rebellion, like the anarchic punk, but that will probably require a different episode. This is also not to say that since the 70s rock music is bad. Not at all. I believe that rock from the 80s and 90s particularly is great, possibly because that's the one I grew up with. The music is great, the concerts were amazing, the performers and artists valuable beyond comparison, but they were stylistic, representative of a genre that wasn't there anymore. Since the 70s, rock has become a style, and with that, artists had to adhere to the core values, the techniques, the rituals, the principle behind the cultural establishment of rock, represented by the gods of reverence, Mick Jagger or Freddie Mercury. And with the death of rock comes the sense of romantic nostalgia, which is at once part of the original themes of rock itself, nostalgia for a free world governed by purity and goodness, where we all were young and beautiful, and also nostalgia for what has been missing since, a true soul of rock, expressed by individual artists, for example, Jagger, Hendrix, or Freddie Mercury, or even Kurt Cobain, who lifted the spirit of rock up for everyone to see. And for those who notice that Freddie Mercury and Kurt Cobain were rock stars mostly after the 70s, it's worth noting that a rock fan gets involved usually with a small range of artists and bands. Coincidentally, the involves begin in the teenager years, and also coincidentally, the involvement lasts a lifetime, to the general exclusion of most other bands. One might argue that the story of young rebellion that slowly, with age, turns into moderate acceptance, flavored with nostalgia for a past of rebellion and purity, is pretty much the same story regardless of the decade you were brought up as a teenager and regardless of what rock band exactly you were listening to. Rock today sounds as good as always, and great artists have developed and refined it. But if you think that rock is more than just music, then what is rock standing for or against today? Is it a unifying force that transcends languages and culture to meet people in peace against wars and corruption? Or it acts as if it was such force? When I listen to my favorite rock songs, I often feel how I am very consciously maintaining alive my own delusion. A very sweet one, filled with electricity and nostalgia. And I wonder whether the artists know how much I need that delusion not to leave me. In conclusion, classical music is either a big container of music written in Europe somewhere in the past, which is a quite useless definition, or is the music of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Therefore, is a style of composing, an aesthetic purpose. Jazz is neither a genre nor a style. Is for me a way of making music, a way to interpret transforming existing music in an individual way. If a term is needed, I would choose the term language for jazz. Jazz is an oral musical language. Pop, instead, is a genre. It's a huge container of all sorts of influences. Pretty much whatever is considered popular, that is distilled for public appeal. But rock was a genre when it was alive, and now it is a style, sometimes done well, sometimes not. I hope I haven't annoyed any of my rock fan listeners. Please get in touch if you like to comment on this, and thank you for tuning in, thank you for listening, and I will see you the next time on Where is the Music podcast.